Unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect Dharma is rarely met with, even in 100,000 million kalpas. Having it to see and listen to, remember and accept, I vow to taste the truth of the Tathagata's teachings. In Buddhism, when Zen practitioners share their understandings of the teachings and practice, it's offered on the basis of dana paramita. Dana is a Pali word that means generosity or to give freely, and this is done so without the expectation of anything in return when the opportunity arises. Those who share the teachings at Great Tree do so on a dana basis. Please support their practice by giving what you can. You can go to the greattreetemple.org website, and there's a giving tab near the upper right corner. Our speaker today is our abbess, Rev Teijo Munnich. Daiju Teijo means Great Tree Right Stillness. Rev Teijo is a disciple and Dharma heir of Rev Dainin Katagiri. She studied with him from 1975 until his death in 1990, receiving formal training at Hokyoji in Minnesota, Tassajara Zen Mountain Center in California, and Hosshinji Sodo in Obama, Japan. Rev Munnich was ordained as a Zen priest in 1981, and in 1983 she began to envision a practice center and community, at its heart a residential practice center for women. This came to be Great Tree Zen Women's Temple, incorporated in 2004 and opened in 2005. The title of her talk today is Teacher and Student, the Practice of Hatching an Egg. And the image that's in the flyer, if you saw it sent out this weekend, was a chicken and an egg, so I'm curious about that.
Marty. Well, then I don't know where to start. Should I start with the chicken and the egg?
Which one?
Which one?
Yeah.
Which comes first, the chicken or the egg? I started to talk about this a little bit at Zen Center the other night. And it's interesting. I've been sort of thinking about this ever since I decided to talk about it. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it, I think, is because that is and has been a big question for me about, first of all, what is a teacher in this practice? And secondly, what is a student in this practice? And then what is that relationship in this practice? So when I was ordained, I didn't think anything like I'm going to become a teacher. But one night, shortly after I was ordained, probably 4 or 5 months after I was ordained, there was a dinner at Minnesota Zen Center for people who had who were supporters of Minnesota Zen Center. And I happened to be sitting next to Katagiri Roshi at this dinner, and the person across from me and I were having a conversation, and for some reason the idea of ordination came up, and he said, "So what does it mean to be ordained?" And I, first of all, I didn't have an answer, but secondly, Katagiri Roshi was sitting right next to me, so I just turned to him and said, "What does it mean to be ordained?" And he just said, "It means you become a teacher." And I'm like, "Wait, what?" Because I hadn't really thought about that. But so it kind of was on my radar. This was 1981, so I didn't have to think about it for a long time. And I didn't. But when Roshi died, it kind of came back. And I was making a list of what things I wanted to do with my my ordination, with what did I want to do with my life, kind of. And one of the things was, that I would eventually teach, but I put myself on hiatus for about 5 years, and that was part of my whole thing was, well, I don't have to teach for 5 years. So I was giving myself a little break. it didn't exactly work out in that way because people would ask me, you know, can you give a talk or can you lead a retreat or something like that? And, I couldn't say no because I sort of felt like that would be breaking one of the precepts. There's a precept about not begrudging the Dharma. And I always understood that to mean that if you're asked to talk about this practice, that you shouldn't hold back. And there's a real strong tendency to say, oh, well, I don't know anything about this. So, you know, I haven't practiced long enough, so I shouldn't be talking about this. But I think, I don't know whether I got this understanding from my teacher or what, but somehow I felt that I was compelled to respond in some way. And of course, anyone who has taught anything knows that to teach is to learn. When I first started teaching dance in an elementary story school, I was asked to start a dance program because I was studying a lot of dance, but I had never taught dance before. And I remember thinking, well, I would love to share what I have experienced because I loved dance, but I don't know what I'm doing. You know, I'm not advanced enough to be teaching. And yet there was something very compelling about it. And one of the things that this person who started this school said to me when he asked me to start this program was that he was very affected by something I had said at a staff meeting. I wasn't teaching dance at the time. I was working in the after school program, but I had said that when I started really throwing myself into dance, that my mind worked better. And he thought that they needed some kind of physical education program there, and that's turned out to be that. And one of the things that I learned is how much I did know. From teaching, I learned how much I knew. And but of course, I didn't really think this would happen in the Zen world. But anyway, I was holding off. I was living in a cabin out in the mountains, and occasionally someone would find me and say, "Can you come and teach us how to do zazen, or can you come and give a talk or something like that, and or lead a retreat?" And so I would do that. But whenever I did it, whenever particularly I led a retreat, I always thought, well, you know, really, all the teaching is to just do the practice, because that was something I had really observed about my teacher, is that his teaching was not so much in what he said, although occasionally he would say something that would really touch me in such a way that I would go. And I remember when that happened, it would be like during a talk. I'd just be sitting there kind of taking it in, and then all of a sudden he'd say something, and I would go, oh. And it would sort of awaken something in me. But in general, it wasn't so much what he said, because most of the time I didn't really know what he was talking about. He was talking about Dogen, and even aside from his difficulty in pronouncing the English language, which made it difficult to understand, I had difficulty understanding what Dogen was talking about. And I couldn't read Dogen. I had no idea what he was talking about. I thought, actually, I felt for a long time that Dogen was kind of crazy. And, you know, it took me a long time before I had enough practice under my belt to be able to say, oh, I know what he's talking about. So anyway, I didn't understand what he was saying, but what all of us realized after he died was how he embodied the practice. He was a very serious practitioner and threw himself into the practice maybe a little bit more than was good for his physical health. But nevertheless, and he never said no when he was invited somewhere. So I realized early on that that was what I needed to do, but still there's this sort of feeling when you're sitting up in front of a group of people that you should be doing something. And so there was this kind of push-pull for me, like they're waiting for me to say something. There is this story in the Shoyoroku, the Book of Serenity, which is a collection of stories from China about interactions between teachers and students or about teachers. There's this story in there that I first encountered when I was in the monastery. And it's about this teacher that was the head of the monastery, and he hadn't given a talk for a really long time. So his students were saying, he hasn't given a talk for a really long time. So somebody go ask him why and ask him if he'll give a talk. So one of his students went to him and said, we want you to give a talk. Could you please come to the Dharma hall and give a talk? And so he went in and they rang the bells and they did the chants and he sat there for a period of time, and then he did the final chant and got up and left. And I always thought, that's so cool. That's what I want to do, because that's really all you can do is, just sit, just be there. But one time, when we were giving talks at Minnesota Zen Center, when we had practice periods, we each had to give 1 or 2 talks during the practice period about a particular subject. And this one person got up there and he just sat there. And he didn't say anything and he didn't do anything. And I remember thinking, oh, he's so arrogant. And then I thought, wait a minute, this is that I used to give a talk, and sometimes we give talks in practice periods. Sometimes Roshi would be out of town, and so when he went out of town, he'd ask someone to give a talk. And I remember thinking, oh, I'm just going to get up there and sit there as long as I can, without saying anything, and just see if I can really get deeply into my practice. And I would sit there and I would just feel all this pressure from the group, like, when's she gonna say something? When's she gonna say something? And I don't know whether that was my projection or whether that was really there, but there is that sort of feeling of expectation when you're sitting up in front of a group. And like, say something that will inspire us, which of course no one feels in any way qualified to do, including Katagiri Roshi. He used to point to himself and say, this stupid person. He would sit with his mudra. And most people didn't notice this, but I always noticed he would get his mudra, and the beginning of his mudra would be going like this when he would begin to give a talk. And so, there's this sort of discomfort about talking about one of us. And what can I say that would be correct? You always think you're going to make a mistake in your understanding. Bless you. At a certain point, you begin to understand that there's no one who really understands the Dharma. One time, we practiced Shikantaza at Minnesota Zen Center, and Katagiri Roshi never really explained to us what Shikantaza was. Once in a while, bless you, he would say something like, Shikantaza is, just return to your breath, or something like that. And so when I went to Japan, my teacher said, what's your practice? My first Dokusan, he said, what's your practice? And I said, what do you mean, what's my practice? And he said, well, there's different kinds of practices. There's Shikantaza, there's following your breath, there's koan study. I don't know what there were like 5 of them. And I said, well, what's the difference between Shikantaza and following your breath? And so then he said, well, Shikantaza is not doing nothing. And following your breath is following your breath. And so he said, which what's your practice? And I said, Shikantaza. And he said, why? And I said, well, that's all I've ever done. So, may as well do that. And so he didn't really press me too much after that. But then I saw Katagiri Roshi. He was doing a sabbatical in Japan, and I went to stay with him and his wife to my son for about 10 days. And I said, so Roshi, Aratasuki Roshi says that Shikantaza is just doing nothing, and it's different from following your breath. But you said that it's to return to your breath. And he looked at me and he said, no one knows what Shikantaza is. And that's really kind of a telling response, I think. No one knows what the Dharma is. And, having studied Dogen with Shohaku, and partly I understand Dogen a little bit better now because I practice longer, but partly Shohaku has read a lot of commentaries that have been written about Dogen's writings, which are not translated into English. And so he has a broader understanding of it. And of course, he draws also from his own practice. But they start to say, oh, the one thing that Shohaku is doing right now is he gives a series of lectures about various fascicles of Dogen's Shobogenzo. So Shobogenzo is like chapters, there's like 95 chapters in the standard version that is accepted by in Japanese Zen right now. And so he gives several lectures about them based on his understanding, based on these commentaries and his Zazen practice. And every single time that he gives one of these, and I've transcribed several of them, he will go through kind of the historical understanding of whatever it is Dogen is. And then he says, but taking issue with the traditional understanding or the understanding of the day, and this to me is very important for us to realize in this practice that there is nothing really to know, and there's nothing that we can know, and that whenever we have an aha or an insight, it's very valuable, but it's not the final understanding. That it's constant effort to let go of that understanding of our understanding or of what we think we understand, and return to beginner's mind. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, says Suzuki Roshi, Shinya Suzuki Roshi. And in the mind of the expert, there are few possibilities. So we limit ourselves when we think we know something. So it makes it difficult and also a little bit easier to talk about the Dharma. First of all, I always want to make sure that what I'm saying is what is happening right now. It is authentically what I'm experiencing in the present moment. And yet there are these historical teachings, these teachings by Dogen and by Bodhidharma and by not just those teachers, but even people like Thich Nhat Hanh and Katagiri Roshi and Shinya Suzuki Roshi that give us some insight or point to some insight about this practice. We have to constantly be awakening And that's where the chicken and the egg comes in. And I'm gonna read you what Katagiri Roshi says about this, and honestly, I didn't hear this from him first. I just found it in a book recently. My teacher in Japan mentioned it to me. When I was talking to him one time. And now I'm gonna find what Katagiri Roshi describes it. I've got too many notes here. Here we go. He's talking about rapport. He says there is a way to contact moment called kano doko, the way of rapport or connection. Rapport is not something mysterious, it's very real. Buddhism tells us we should study and practice with the teacher because rapport is like a mother hen and her baby chick. The chick taps its shell from the inside at the same time that the hen taps the shell from the outside. And then there's this word BWAAK, block. The baby chick is born. If you want to seek for something that is unattainable, first you have to tap your shell from the inside, and then someone or something taps your shell from the outside. This is a very real way of practice, a very real way of touching truth and realizing your own Buddha nature. So this is something that Katagiri Roshi, how he explained this teacher-student relationship. I was looking for somewhere, there was somewhere I thought in Returning to Silence where he talked about that relationship as a relationship, as a way of back and forth. And often I tell this story about when I said to him, I feel like you're pulling me up the mountain. And he said, you wake me up. And somewhere in his writing, he talks about how you can't be a teacher without a student. And I have felt that so many times that when people show up for this practice, when people come for these talks, that there is something that happens, something that awakens on both sides, that kind of tapping, that kind of connection that's happening. So Shohaku, in the book Mountains and Waters Sutra, which is a commentary on Dogen's Mountains and Waters Sutra, he talks about this teacher and student relationship, and he talks about his own teacher, Uchiyama Roshi. Uchiyama Roshi was pretty extroverted, in my experience, a pretty extroverted and kind of an in-your-face kind of guy. I say that both from my experience of meeting him and also from my experience of reading his one of the translations of one of his books about the Tenzo Kyokun, instructions to the cook, and Shohaku translated these teachings, and I felt that in his writing, in all of his writing, though, I felt that kind of like, kind of slap you across the face, wake you up kind of thing. But Shohaku says that Uchiyama Roshi said, well, I'll read to you what he says. He says, Uchiyama Roshi said, I never face my students. You want to be my student, you should face the same direction. So we faced Buddha and we saw Uchiyama Roshi's back, not his face. He never took care of his students. He just carried out his own practice wholeheartedly. If I wanted to be his disciple, I had to follow his direction. I had to walk with my own legs. He often said, the teacher is not a caretaker or a babysitter. It reminded me of one of my friends who, she was the student of it. She was from the United States. She was from California, but and she was very smart. And she was kind of in that genius bracket, and so she really caught on to things very fast. But of course, that doesn't help you in the Zen world, how smart you are. In fact, you're better off if you're not too smart when you practice Zazen. Because it's more of Zazen Shikantaza is experiential learning. You sit down and you learn from sitting down and looking at a wall. But anyway, she was talking to her teacher one time, and her teacher, this teacher, was the head of the monastery, had practiced Rinzai first for I don't know how many years, and then he left the monastery in the middle of the night because he really felt like that wasn't it, and he met another teacher who was a Soto Zen teacher, and in Rinzai there's more of that kind of. I had a Rinzai teacher come to Minnesota Zen Center one time, and he looked at me and he asked a question and he wanted the answer. He said, "Answer me," or something. He wanted the answer right away. So it's that kind of style of teaching. And of course, I just froze. I couldn't say anything, but because I wasn't used to that. But so Harada Roshi had a little bit of that, and so he looked at this person one day and he said, "Tell me what you're thinking." And she blurted out, "Why don't you tell me what to do?" And she said she was so embarrassed because she always perceived herself to be a very independent kind of person. But I think many of us, maybe all of us, come to this practice with this idea that a teacher is someone who is going to solve your problems for you or is going to tell you what to do. And I'm a pretty bossy person, so I have that inclination anyway. But Katagiri Roshi really didn't often tell us what to do. And for me, that worked really well because when I went to the Minnesota Zen Center, I was still kind of pushing away all that had been overlaid on my thinking by my Catholic upbringing. And every ways that things had been interpreted. And so I was really resisting being told what to do. And because I had really bought into it, I've been a very good Catholic student. And so my rebellion came in when I left the convent and started to just explore life outside of Catholicism. And so I remember sitting down at the Zen Center and feeling when I walked in there that there was a bit of a cult. My impression of the students there was that they were kind of worshiping the teacher, and I really felt resistant to that. And I remember sitting down in Zazen and thinking, if he tells me what to do, I'm out of here. And I felt pretty strongly about that. And fortunately, he didn't. He just modeled it in such a way that he affected a lot of people in that way because we all kept coming. And I really didn't think that I would stay very long, but you see what happened. So although I don't think that Katagiri Roshi was quite as strong about holding back as Uchiyama Roshi apparently was, and I say he apparently was because I lived at Shohaku Okumura's temple, the temple he was taking care of, about an hour outside of Kyoto. And people would come and people would go. There was a place that had been built for students to stay at this temple, so they could come and practice. And he always refused to have any kind of talk with him about, ask him a question about something, he would always say to me, "Oh, would you answer their question?" Because he knew that that was something that Katagiri Roshi did, and that probably used to do that until he came to the United States, and people kind of pressured him to offer Dokusan. But even his Dokusans, I went to talk to Shohaku and Dokusan one time when I was feeling conflicted about it, and he responded to me with one sentence, and that was it. And that was all I needed. It was a great response, but he was very resistant to have that kind of one-on-one interaction with students. So I saw that, but Katagiri Roshi did not resist that. And one time I went to Dokusan, and I had one question just followed another. It was just one of those kinds of times where we just engaged in this conversation. And I remember I went in and it was light out, and when I was done, it was dark out. And apparently it had been like a 2-hour conversation, but I didn't realize it. But most of the time it was shorter than that. So he was very willing to engage in that way, and even though he was always comfortable with it. And Shohaku goes on to say, actually, he helped a lot. He always pointed out which way to go, which way I should go. But once I started to walk in a direction, he didn't say, you shouldn't do this or that. And then another thing that he says is, Uchiyama Roshi often said, no human being can be a true teacher. Only Buddha and Zazen are our true teachers. So, that's kind of where I started talking about this, because I really feel that Zazen is my teacher. And when Katagiri Roshi died, I felt the need to get away from Minnesota Zen Center for various reasons. Most of the reason was that I had been right in the center of between him and the Sangha as a liaison between the family and the Sangha and the doctors and the Sangha. And that's a very difficult position to be in, but it kind of set me up as someone that people came to after he died to help them with their grief. And I knew that I had to do my own processing. And so Shohaku came along. It was the first time, no, it was the second time that I met him. He came to Minnesota Zen Center. He was kind of touring the United States at the time. And he gave some talks, and I talked to him about something I was interested in from Dogen Zenji. And he invited me to his temple to help with his translation, because his translation was somewhat limited by the fact that he doesn't understand the nuances of the English language, and thought that he might not have chosen the correct words to express what he wanted to say, because these characters have such broad meanings. And so I sort of jumped at that opportunity and went back 6 months at his temple working on this translation. And as part of that, he offered 5-day sessions every month. And his sessions were very difficult because in Uchiyama Roshi's tradition, he didn't give lectures, he didn't give dokusan. All they did was they sat zazen. They didn't do chanting. All he did was they sat zazen and they did work together. And they still do that in his lineage. And so this was how the sessions were set up, no chanting. No, we didn't even work during sessions. We just ate, slept, and sat. And we sat for 50-minute periods. And so for me, this was just a perfect way of sitting with what actually was a big transition in my life, because I no longer had a teacher to defer to and ask my questions to. And I found myself sitting during the sessions and something would come up and I would think, oh, I'll ask Katagiri Roshi about that. And then I realized that he was no longer around. And I started recognizing that, that actually I had taken responsibility for these questions that came up. And very rarely did I actually ask him questions that came up in my practice. But what happened is they come up and I think, oh, I'll ask him about that. And then I didn't get obsessive about finding answers. The answers just kind of came up naturally. And this is what I discovered when I was doing those sessions, those 5-day sessions with at his temple, at Shohaku's temple. And this is something that we should all recognize. While it's very valuable to look at the teachings and have someone in your life, and I never asked Katagiri Roshi to be my teacher. The closest I ever came was I said to him one time, I said, I really need someone to help me see my practice and see my life from another perspective. Could you help me with that? He said, yes. And so that was as close as I came to saying, would you be my teacher? But I, in fact, went to him with questions, but also gave my questions to him within my practice. In other words, put my questions not aside, but put my questions just on my radar and didn't try to find answers. And sometimes they came up in Dokusanin, but not very often. Most of the time, my questions were answered in my own Zazen practice. And so I think this is something we all need to remember, while at the same time appreciating how we teach each other and how we can learn from each other. I guess I consider Shohaku one of my teachers because I have learned a lot from him, and I learned a lot from his practice. And when he talks about Shodogen, he's talking about it really purely from his own experience, although he looks to these commentaries that have been written. And when I look to Shohaku, or I look to Katagiri Roshi, now I go back to Katagiri Roshi's teachings. One of the things that I did before I left Minnesota Zen Center to move to North Carolina was I went downstairs at the Minnesota Zen Center, and I used this little machine that we have to copy many of his lectures, and I picked up I've got a whole case of his lectures, tapes of his lectures that I copied to refer to when I was interested in a particular subject, just to see what he had to say about it, and to see if anything that he had to say resonates for me, to help bring my understanding a little further along. But as I was thinking about this teacher-student relationship, I was also thinking about how much Sangha plays a part and how much we learn from each other. When I was teaching at Warren Wilson, I had the students journal about certain subjects. Particularly, we started for the intro to Zen or intro to Buddhism class. I thought, well, what is the heart of the Buddhist teaching, which turned out to be the title of one of Thich Nhat Hanh's books, where he talks about the Four Noble Truths. But I kind of came to this on my own before that book was even published, that the Four Noble Truths is the heart of the Buddhist teaching. Because within the Four Noble Truths, if you study the Four Noble Truths, you have to study everything that Buddha taught, everything that is part of Buddha's teachings. And so that's what we studied for the first 4 weeks of the 8-week term at Warren Wilson. yeah, I think it was 8 weeks. And during that time, I asked questions that had come up for me, because the Four Noble Truths has been the basic teaching that I have studied since I was ordained. I wanted to find one thing to study, and that was something I had lots of questions about. And so that's what I studied. And so I just put out those questions to the students. I put out a lot of the questions that came up for me, things that I thought would be helpful for them in reflecting on this, and things that would bring them into the books that we were studying, that I thought explained the Four Noble Truths so well. And I remember so often reading those journals and thinking, oh, realizing something new about the teachings. So the teachings, the writings, the ways, things that have written about them, and also the Sangha. My students became my Sangha. We became each other's teachers. And so often, I can't say, I taught so many of those classes, I don't even remember how many I taught, of the Intro to Zen, over and over, the same thing exactly. And every time that I taught it, I learned something new. So there's something we learn from ourselves, something we learn from people who have practiced longer than us, who inspire us in some way. But there's also something we can learn from the Sangha. So Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, these are our teachers. The teacher isn't one person, and it's not one thing. In the case of, if someone asks me, will you be my teacher? The first time that I was asked, I just said flat out, I said, I really don't know what that means. I'm really sorry, but I don't know what that means. But it did send me on sort of a journey of reflecting on what that did mean. And I came to the point where I realized that part of my journey with Katagiri Roshi was that I trusted him. I trusted him, I trusted his practice. And because I trusted him, it helped me in those moments when I was confused, to kind of always know that I had somewhere to go where I could ask a question that would help me get grounded again. So that trust was very important. And sometimes he's not often, but sometimes he suggested I do something that I really didn't want to do, that I had a lot of resistance to. And but I did it. For example, teaching. I'm teaching. I give talks because he suggested it. And this is the way my whole practice was. If he made a suggestion, even though it wasn't directly to me, I took it very seriously and followed through on it. And because I always knew that there was something to learn from that. And teaching, as I said, teaching is learning. Teaching is another part of practicing. And he had us teaching. A lot of teachers won't let their students teach. My teacher in Japan wouldn't let his students teach. He didn't have them giving talks for a very, very long time. But Katagiri Roshi threw us into the fray right away. I mean, within the first 2 years of my practice at Minnesota Zen Center, I was also already asked to give Zazen instruction. And I was like, wait, I haven't been doing this long. I can't really but doing it it gives us, every one of us, something to share. As Dogen Zenji says, from the very first time we do Zazen, we awaken. Every single time we do Zazen, awakening happens. And so we do have something to share. And when we dig a little deeper, we are able to find what it is that we have learned and that we can share. Just a second. I wrote some things this morning, and I was just trying to Oh, yeah, this is something I wrote this morning when I was thinking about it. I thought when I went to Tassajara for the first time in 1983, I often asked myself, what would Katagiri Roshi do? Somehow I always had an answer. As I look back, I realized that I had been watching him. I watched every move he made, trying to learn the forms and movements of Zen practice. It was like learning a dance. I had not been learning the forms because I was a priest, or even consciously aspired to become a priest. I didn't think about becoming a priest at all until he brought it up to me. I knew the details of forms and rituals because I was drawn to them, and I was drawn to the way that he did. For example, one of the things I became aware of from watching Katagiri Roshi was to put the incense straight when offering it at the altar. I don't remember him ever telling us to place how to place the incense, but I do remember watching him offer incense. First, he broke a tiny piece off the end to make sure the bottom tip was straight, because Japanese incense has both ends are sort of, I don't know, sort of beveled or something. I guess it's from the way it's made. He broke off a tiny tip, then placed the stick of incense into the bowl full of ashes, adjusting it until it was perfectly straight. In order to offer powdered incense, he took a piece of stick incense and broke it into smaller pieces. And customarily, charcoal was lit for offering powdered incense, but we didn't have any at Minnesota Zen Center. So he broke off these short pieces of incense and then lit them and then lined them up on top of the ashes so that the ends provided a place for the powdered incense to get lit. And then he would set a little bit of incense down on top of these pieces of incense. And I didn't encounter charcoal at all until they did that at Tassajara too. Until I went to Japan, they used charcoal. And now we use charcoal here, so nobody knows how to do this. But if we don't get the charcoal lit in time, I just go back to this old way. And I just watched him do these things. And I'm so grateful that I watched so much because I really learned a lot. And he didn't tell us these things. But when I went to Japan, I got into a situation where we had this thing called dope choka, where one person did choka is morning service, dope choka and dope banka, where one person would do it alone on behalf of everybody because we were busy. We were going on takuhatsu and everything, so we needed a little more time to prepare. And so this one person would do it alone. And when I would do dope choka, you would do it on behalf of, you would be the person who was leading it, you would be the person who was ringing the bells, and you would represent the sangha that do the chanting. And so you would go up and offer the incense. One day I was in a little bit of a hurry, and so I went up and put the incense down, and I remember thinking it was crooked, but thinking, oh well, no one will see it. And I started to walk away, and I heard a voice from somewhere say, Teijo-san, make the incense straight. So I, you know what, and I knew it, what I had learned from Katagiri Roshi just from watching was something that actually was a very important thing, not just for Katagiri Roshi, but in the whole practice. You know, this is the kind of things you learn in the monasteries, to put the incense straight. So anyway, I guess that's all I have to say really, but maybe some of you have comments or questions about something I said. Anybody?
I think the whole chicken egg teacher also reminds me of the term I heard around the mountain seat, like gift. That's all I heard.
I just have a question. you were saying, well, I guess my question is, how do you view Buddha as a teacher? And is it any different from how you view Katagiri Roshi as a teacher?
I view Katagiri Roshi as a Buddha. Yeah. And I think when I say that, I also know that it's my sense of what is Buddha. It's more, Dogen Zenji says everything is Buddha nature. Not everything has Buddha nature, or everyone has Buddha nature, but everything is Buddha nature. And that means every one of us is Buddha nature, is part of what Buddha nature is. And Buddha nature really is nothing but things as they are. And when we are in the present moment, we recognize, maybe not consciously, in retrospect, maybe we say, oh, I was in the present moment or something. But when we are in the present moment, we recognize and express what is called true nature, or how does calls it my true self. He calls us our true self. And it happens in Zazen. And it happens when, it means, what my students at Rose used to call getting in the flow. You feel that your kind of things are just moving. You're moving with the sangha, you're moving with whatever is happening, and your response is very authentic. But when Thich Nhat Hanh talks about Buddha as in Buddha Dharma, so learn to recognize our own Buddha nature. We look to someone who is expressing something that we are aspiring to. Does that make sense?
I think so.
Oh, it's 10:59. I guess we're done. Do you want to make any announcements?
Yes. Give me just a second. Okay, well, what's today? So on let's see, coming up on Tuesday, November 4th, Zen Center of Asheville will be hosting an intro to Zen class at 7 p.m., which is an in-person only, so local only. Wednesday evening, we'll be having a Beaver full moon gathering here, which starts at 7 p.m. and that is online and in person. On November 8th, the Zen Center of Asheville is having a half-day sitting, which goes all the way from 6 a.m. to 12 noon. So if you're interested in the half-day sitting, you can visit their website, and I believe that's also in person only. And this upcoming weekend, we'll also be having our fall session for November. So registration is still open. It's November 7th through 12th. If you're interested in registering, you can email me at info@greattreetemple.org, or you could sign up on the website. And then our speaker next weekend, or for Sesshin weekend, will be Liliane, Dr. Liliane Murin-Papin. And the title of her talk will be Tending to Our Autumnal Grief and Sadness, which is relatable. Yeah, that's what we have.
May the merit of this practice,
May the merit of this practice
benefit all beings, and bring peace. Thank you all for coming, helping me think about this. I wouldn't have been thinking about it so deeply if you hadn't been here, so thank you.